we don't have too much time, so we'll just start the second session right away. And in this session, we are going to deal with what are the options before India, regardless of what happens in Afghanistan. And the reason for this particular session is because in the popular perception, we hear a lot of bizarre options being discussed uh, by people who probably have never seen the map of Afghanistan or the map of India, or who have no idea of how military logistics work, how difficult it is to actually do the kind of stuff they are suggesting India needs to do. And it's precisely for that reason we have a very good panel, people who've been there, done that, especially somebody like Mr. Karju, who's aware of all the bizarreness, which the kind of suggestions which come out very often. Uh, and the important thing for us in India is that regardless of what happens in Afghanistan, it does have a fallout in India. And one way or another, we need to protect ourselves, defend ourselves, and take steps to ensure that the fallout is the minimum possible. Without much ado, I think we'll start off. I'll ask General BK Sharma. He's of course a veteran. He's a strategic thinker. He's associated with the USI, and my association with him actually goes back because he's in a sense related to me, because he's from the same regiment as my brother-in-law, and he was a senior officer. So we have a certain nexus out there. After General Sharma, I'll request Indrani Bagchi, who is my favorite journalist, because she doesn't pull any punches. She shoots from the hip, and is a straight talker, and says the hard realities in the hardest possible way. She doesn't couch it. We'll then have Mr. Tilak Deveshwar, who is probably the most prolific writer on Pakistan in India today. A man, I think, in 3 years has written three absolutely superb books on Pakistan. He claims that he's in search of an idea for a fourth book, but because he's an old intelligence man, I'm sure he's misleading me on that. And he has an idea and he's working on his book. We'll take his take next, and then finally we'll have Ambassador Vivek Karju bring up the rear and round off the discussion before we throw it up to the floor. So, General Sharma, please, sir.
Much. I was, as per your list, supposed to be the last speaker. So good, you turned the tables on me, but we've already. So I will actually get to the brass tacks. Basically, my perspective is based on my visits to Afghanistan and having been, at the center stage in organizing 4 India-Afghanistan security dialogues, and also my discussions with a whole lot of people there. I have been to a number of cities, and that is very recently. Now, as of today, the efficacy of India's policy on Afghanistan stands vindicated. That we did not jump into the fray and we maintained our course, and I think that's a good beginning. But there are critical uncertainties we cannot be oblivion to, and we have to factor them in terms of recalibration of our policy options for Afghanistan. And first and foremost thing is that no matter what course and complexion the post-election scenario takes, there is going to be ethno-politicization of Afghanistan, and that will pose a challenge for India because both factions have a lot of hopes and aspirations vis-a-vis India. How do we balance between Pashtun, non-Pashtun, and many other shades in between is another factor. Another issue I would like to talk about, the character of Taliban. The Taliban we should not be looking at with a myopic or a jaundiced eye as we used to see them. They have evolved a lot, they have changed a lot, and they've also made certain conciliatory statements towards India. Therefore, I think it's with a certain degree of freshness that we should be looking at Taliban and the doors that we want to open towards them. As far as America is concerned, I have never taken America's talk on with India very, very seriously. They were very, very inimical to our presence there, our heightened diplomatic profile. Again, they are cozying up to to Pakistanis, and that is their Hobson choice. So, in fact, as of today, the American policy, and as late as the press meeting which took place yesterday, Trump has very clearly said that, well, he's going to rely a lot on Pakistanis. As far as Pakistan is concerned, while tactically they may make certain conciliatory moves and try and sort of look as a very good and a well-meaning interlocutor, but deep down their policy is going to be, Afghan policy is going to be India-centric. I had a lot of discussions with General Nicholson and who had met Kamar Bajwa, and he said, no matter what happens in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, our policy, our strategy on Afghanistan is going to be India-centric. Now, in the past, they have been telling Afghans that, you should actually tone down your bilateral relations with India and do not get close to them. And in the bargain, we will try and create some kind of Pakistan-China consortium and come to your help and come with a very big package deal. So we have to be little watchful of such like developments. But it is not going to be an easy or a cakewalk for Pakistan per se, because no matter what they do, I think their relationship in the long run with Taliban is going to be quite intricate. And there are three factors that I would like to flag here. First is this Durand Line dilemma is not going to be resolved in any time soon. Second thing is this Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, which is gaining traction on both sides of Durand Line, is again going to be a very big challenge. And no matter, since most of the this terrorist infrastructure in Pakistan is intact, all the fingers are going to point at Pakistan that they have still giving safe haven to these terrorists and things like that. Now, other aspects that we have to actually deal with is the fighting within Taliban, because if you look at Bonn 2001 process, probably a lot of people who are left out of that process actually picked up the weapons and they joined Taliban. This time over, not everybody is going to be happy with the reconciliation process, and there would be people who would actually start fighting. And particularly, there is some kind of a rift between Akhundzada and Sirajuddin Haqqani, and between the field commanders, and most of them are not very amenable to talk. So how do we deal with that? And the new kid on the block is this Islamic State of Khorasan province, who, my way of looking at, will keep the pot boiling. And so are there so many Pak-centric groups, who are actually directly feeding out of hands of ISI, who will also keep the pot boiling there in one way or the other. I would not talk about, the prognosis of intra-Afghan dialogue, and of course we should play an important role. But other contentious issues that are going to be there is disarming, demobilization of armed groups. Taliban themselves are going to make a pitch for the reorganization and reconfiguration of Afghan National Army, which is actually predominantly Tajik officer-led. And then we are also not very certain if at all the resumption of dialogue takes place, what are the conditions for ceasefire and who are going to be the guarantors of that ceasefire, and whether these people will actually hold to whatever guarantees these people are giving. So in nutshell, actually, I think the violence level in Afghanistan for times to come is going to remain very high, and India has to be extremely mindful of that. Now, one thing that we have to be very, very careful is that Pakistan, without being overtly involved, can actually target our consulates and some of our people there. There are 9 engineers who were actually kidnapped and they are still missing, and they have actually attacked our consulates. They've attacked our embassy in the past. And just to sort of keep India a little bit in a tight spot, those kind of attacks can still be orchestrated there. So the first and foremost thing is that we have to address our point security. Presently, we have the ITBP people there who provided a very good cover. There are some ITBP commandos, but it is high time that we actually complement some of these people by sending our SFF people there, for some kind of a reconnaissance, area awareness. Similarly, NSG and such like people should also go in the guise of, as official delegations and try and map different situations and work out on different kind of contingencies. Should some kind of contingencies actually erupt, then it should not be another Kandahar crisis, and we should be much better prepared to deal with those kind of crisis conditions. There are other areas post-Taliban. There is a lot we can do in the security arena as far as building up the capacity of Afghan National Security Forces concerned. In fact, Afghans have a very high expectations from us as far as this particular aspect is concerned, but they do not want our boots on ground. They only want our help in terms of capacity building. And there is some kind of a despair that when chips were really down and they needed Indian help very badly, we were dithering. I think we have to see that next time over, whenever they are really in difficult situation, we must make a sound policy choice and should not dilly-dally. Now, areas where we can particularly help them is, one is that, they do not have, my way of understanding is they do not have a very well astute counter-terrorism strategy. Most of they are too dependent on Americans, and therefore this is another area there we can actually help them in refining their counter-terrorism strategy. Some of their top journals told me that, journal, whatever you say, sooner or later we'll have to end up fighting Pakistanis on the Durand line. So incrementally build up our capacity so that we can actually challenge Pakistanis on Durand line. So we have to take a call what kind of equipment, military equipment and other things we can give. We need to have a joint working group and some kind of a joint intelligence center sharing, because we have so much of information about these terrorists who are operating there and their modus operandi and all. And those expertise can also be shared with these people. Similarly, there are other areas presently. There are about 1,000 Afghan security personnel who are training in our academies here. There are about 500 children whom we are giving, scholarship. These are the children of the martyrs of Afghanistan. There are about 100 beds which we have allocated in our super specialty hospitals like RR. We have to build up further on these, because most of these vacancies are not being utilized by Afghans because of their operational commitments and lack of knowledge in English. So we have to do capacity building, maybe in situ, something here, so that they can optimally utilize all these offers that India has actually made. Another thing I would like to say here that, most of the training that we render to these people is in our academic institutions, maybe Mao, jungle warfare school and all. And the conditions, they are not very akin to the way Afghans have been fighting. So it is my personal view that why can't we actually create a node of excellence for Afghans, someplace like Leh Ladakh, where the terrain is very, very similar to what is in Afghanistan, and actually train these people for real-time operations in that kind of a place. Other areas where my discussion with them was that now special forces, they are raising more and more companies of special forces. So they need more expertise on special forces training. Air Force has become a prima donna of Afghan National Army. They're helping them a lot. I think Air Force should also be helping them in developing skills. They are very weak in urban terrorism, and you see most of the sensational attacks have either taken place in the green zones or in these high security zones. And they're not actually quite clued up in how to deal with this. This is another area I think India should step in and build up their capacity in fighting urban terrorism. Most of them confided in me that, well, they are not very good at casualty evacuation and management. They are lacking in, plasma and other kind of medicines. This is another area where we could help. Similarly, a model of winning hearts and minds, actually they have actually adopted an American model which is quite alien to Afghan culture. And we have tremendous capacity and skills in this. This is another area where we can help. They are relying on us for more helicopter support, more maintenance, upkeep of the the Soviet origin equipment, which we are quite capable of actually doing. So my way of looking at things is that it's high time we have a window of opportunity now, and we have not lost our credibility there. We're very much popular, we're very much favorable there. I think we should actually shut off some of our self-acquired inertia and have a de novo look at how we can build up better cooperation, particularly in the security arena in Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
I speak loudly. Thank you, Sushant, and thank you, everybody, for this morning. It's actually quite timely. Interesting that you spoke so much about the Durand Line. The Prime Minister of Pakistan was also speaking about the Durand Line. Yeah.
Come.
That's why I was asking you to sit down.
Better late than never.
So it's interesting that you spoke about the Durand Line, because the Prime Minister of Pakistan was also speaking about the Durand Line and the fact that it is not real. It's not really real line because it is just a British invention, which would gladden the heart of any Afghan listening to that speech at the CFR last night. But no, to go back to where India is, I cannot agree more that India has been a lot more hesitant than it should be. And just a couple of months ago, we were bemoaning the fact that this peace deal might actually go through and we would have no voice in it. And I know I got lots of anguished calls from people who shall remain nameless after I wrote a piece on this. But and the general view from the government seemed to be that even if we are not in the room, we can influence matters. We are not God. I mean, come on. But yes, and I think we should shed that. I think we did well by not jumping into a coffee table conversation with the Taliban just because everybody else is doing it. The Taliban, no matter what they say and how they believe they have evolved, haven't really evolved. The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan is what they want and what they will get and what they will fight for forever. That is not going to change. And even if at some point we do reach out to the Taliban, we do have some kind of a conversation with the Taliban, we should not lose sight of that particular reality, because that reality is not going anywhere. And second, I think we should certainly recalibrate the way we look at peace processes on Afghanistan. We have a point of view. We have a particular kind of state that we want to see Afghanistan in. We remain shy of articulating it at the policy level. I mean, people like me can say whatever we want, but nobody really cares, right? But at the policy level, with the weight of the Indian government, we need to have an articulation of what it is. What is the end state of Afghanistan that we want? You do get odd statements from the MEA, many of which contradict each other. So, do we want an election the way it is coming about right now? Did we want a ceasefire before? Nobody knows. We can only imagine. And so I do believe that a future peace process will start again, no question. America wants out, as it should, and that peace process will again involve Pakistan, will again involve Russia, because Russia will play a different game. We should put our cards on the table, insist that even if we don't speak, we need to be in the room. We are the biggest power in this region. We have very critical stakes in Afghanistan. I think it was not in our interests in the last 18 months to not be part of that, to not be at least in the room, even if we did not participate in the discussions. I recognize, Zalmay Khalilzad would not want us there in the same way that Richard Holbrooke, when he was doing his number there several years ago, also didn't want us there. But we have the weight, we have the clout, we need to be there. And we need to be clear about the end state in Afghanistan that we are looking for. Another issue that we should be working on diplomatically is to bring the Central Asian states into the conversation. To bring Iran into the conversation. Now, Iran and America have a problem. So, yes, but that's something that we have to. That's difficult diplomacy, but that's what you need to do. You need to bring the Central Asian states. I know that when the foreign minister was at the SICA summit a few months ago, which was his first sort of multilateral summit, we were told by Central Asian countries, by diplomats there, that every one of them made a representation to Mr. Jaishankar to say that we are really worried about this peace process as it is unfolding. Those are voices we have not heard. And those are voices we should bring to the table. We need to have a much clearer conversation with Russia on Afghanistan. All conversations have stopped at a man called Zamir Kabulov, but we need to go beyond that. That conversation, because they floundered in the same way that the Americans did. So that's a conversation we need to have. And yes, we've started a confidence building measure with China by training a group of Afghan diplomats. And I think that can go on. And that should go on. In fact, we should look for other things that we can do with China in Afghanistan. Who knows? Their INAC copper mines have become an archaeological site. We can do a lot more with them there on innocuous subjects, but we should. We do know that China and Pakistan have a very embedded relationship, and yes, at the core, maybe we would not be able to do much with either of them. Certainly with China, because Pakistan will object, but they're on the fringes. We can do stuff with the Chinese, and we should. The last point is, I think General mentioned all the softer stuff that we could do in terms of medical help and education and capacity building. And of course, we should do all that. But the last bit that I would like to flag is Afghanistan signed its first strategic partnership agreement with India. There is a crucial part in that agreement, which is military assistance. We have shied away from that. We give little bits and pieces like 1 helicopter, 3 helicopters. We should step it up. Openly, we should step it up for the Afghan government. Because along with capacity, they need equipment, they need planes, they need guns, whatever it is that they need. We should not shy away from that, and certainly not be worried of what the Pakistanis will say, because whether you worry about them or not, the Haqqani network has been tasked by Pakistan to attack Indian assets in Afghanistan, which they have done fairly regularly with devastating effect. We should not shy away from asserting our power in Afghanistan anymore. That's my view. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Indrani. You never disappoint. But I can't agree more with you. And I find it really surprising the kind of alibis which especially the Western media hold for the Taliban, as though they're some kind of new poster boys of liberal Islam. And you are absolutely right. They haven't evolved. Everywhere they have captured territory. They've shown themselves to be the same old beasts they were when they had occupied Afghanistan last time around, under, I dare say, Pakistani tutelage. So that alibis continue. Our problem, however, is that you're right. We have the weight and the clout, but we are not pulling it enough. And for some reason, we are quite diffident about doing certain things. We don't want to be seen doing certain things. We have this problem of keep talking about $2 billion, but for a $3 trillion economy to talk about $2 billion, which we have spent over 15 years, you do the math and it doesn't turn out to be very much. So I think we should stop talking about this $2 billion, and I think we need to weigh in a lot more. But perhaps that is something which Mr. Tilak Deveshwar can shed some light on, since he's also a member of the National Security Advisory Board. Maybe he can tell us why we are so diffident.
Not likely. The chair and fellow panelists, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, pleasure to be here today. Very fascinating first panel, and again, a terrific discussion. A few points that I'd like to make is that President Trump calling off the peace talks just provide a window of opportunity to us to play a more active role, the point that Shashank was making. And I think we will have to act fast before the mercurial president changes his mind again and closes the window of opportunity. And I don't think so sitting out is an option any longer. It'll have long-term serious consequences for India. A troubled Afghanistan could lead to conditions that will affect our security interests. Ungoverned spaces or civil war would give a fresh lease of life to Al-Qaeda, to the ISIS, and besides, Pakistan would seek to relocate the Lashkar, the Jaish, across the Durand line. Now, it needs no reiteration that Pakistan sees Indian presence in Afghanistan as a security threat. For a while, it seemed to Pakistan that the US deal with the Taliban would be clinched, and it would see its proxies in Kabul sooner or later. This would have allowed it to finish whatever influence India had in Afghanistan. For the moment, at least, such plans have been stymied. So what Pakistan has been trying to do is to establish a linkage between Afghanistan and recent developments in Kashmir by saying that this might negatively impact the Afghan peace process. This has had a certain salience, certain resonance in the US too, with some think tanks saying, so the Washington-based Center for Strategic and International Studies warning, and I quote, "The Kashmir issue may not only detract Pakistani resources and political will away from Afghanistan, but potentially could also be used as leverage to persuade the United States to intervene with India." With the Taliban having rejected such a linkage, Pakistan is back to square one. Pakistan has also been trying to project that an unstable Afghanistan suits India. This again is very little to takers, because after all, the kind of investments that we have in Afghanistan, a stable Afghanistan is far more in our interest than an unstable one. Then there's this elephant in the room, which is talking to the Taliban. Should India be talking to the Taliban? India has consistently opposed open talks with the Taliban. And the question being asked is that, can we any longer deny that the Taliban have emerged as a real political stakeholder in Afghanistan? With their growing political and military clout, should we change our position just as the US has done and so many other countries have done? Should we not be seeking to mend ties with the Taliban rather than imposing the group? Concern has also been expressed that India could be expected to lose more space in Afghanistan as soon as the American forces withdraw, if we did not have a line open to the Taliban. The Indian Army chief is on record with his comment that India should join the bandwagon, that India needs to establish a relationship with the Taliban. The point was made that the Taliban have evolved. I would agree with Indrani totally. I see absolutely no indications of the Taliban having evolved. They continue to be opposed to the constitution, to democracy, to a parliamentary form of government, to women's rights, to the constitution. And they haven't been fighting for 20 years to share power. They are not in the game to share power. They want to establish an Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and I don't think so we should fool ourselves. Unfortunately, we shouldn't fool ourselves, at least, that the Taliban are there to share power with the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. They want to establish an Islamic Emirate, and that's it. So what options does India have? A few points that I've will listed out. That with the potential worsening security environment, we need to focus on supporting anti-insurgency institutions along with economic development projects. The point that General had made is already being made about how do you support the ANA and the police service. And I agree that the transfer of one Mi-25 helicopter is not going to make much of a difference. We need to be far more forceful. Second, I think India must fully and publicly support the elections, democratic institutions, emphasize fair and credible elections. We've already done this. We need to keep reiterating it. We need to support all our friends, but show neutrality between them. The presidential election undoubtedly has polarized the polity. Post-elections, we'll have to cool tempers, emphasizing creating unity as a counterweight to the Taliban. We should prepare ourselves for a contested poll while hoping that this will not happen. This could deprive the next government of legitimacy at a very critical time. At this stage, it cannot be determined whether the new government would be a transitional one and would soon have to morph into an interim or a national government. Third, Pakistan and Taliban tactic has been to claim that the Taliban represent the Pashtuns who dominate the south and the east. This is what they successfully did in the 1990s. This has to be contested. We cannot concede Pashtun space to the Taliban. We would need to rally moderate Pashtun anti-Taliban forces. There's enough, I think, amongst the Pashtuns in the south and the east to resist the Taliban, and I think we need to make sure that we are there to support them. Taliban can certainly be engaged covertly through agencies, unofficially through think tanks, the ORF, or non-official track 2 level contacts without the formal stamp of the state. The Afghan government should be taken into confidence on this. One resource that we have not used, and I like to sort of put it on the table, is to use Deoband. After all, it's the same ideology of Deoband, which is there also in among the Taliban as it is there in India, and this is the alma mater. Sure, so many shuras and the various delegations have gone to Indonesia and other places. I don't see why Deoband should not be involved, should the government so feel. Another key option that India has is the Chabahar port that will reduce Afghanistan's dependence on Pakistan. India has sent shipments of grain to demonstrate the viability of the route, but unfortunately the progress and post-development has been slow. In response to a Lok Sabha query in January 2019, the Minister of State for Shipping revealed that since 2016, India had spent a very paltry amount out of the budgeted amount. Of course, the blame also rests on the fact that there is pressure on Iran because of the sanctions imposed by the US. That certainly complicates the matter. But I think Chabahar is one option that we have, which we need to pursue. We need to strengthen the All India Radio Pashto and Dari services, both in terms of periodicity and content. Since 1947, I think we have 1 hour of Pashto and 1 hour of Dari service. 70 years later, we still continue to have just an hour or so. We certainly need to increase the duration of the service and also the content. There's also a need to set up an Afghan think tank, something like the Afghan Institute of India. Today, most think tanks in India, especially in Delhi, Afghanistan, unfortunately, like Pakistan, is adjunct to some center or the other, like neighborhood studies or something else. There is no center in India on Afghanistan studies looking dedicatedly at Afghanistan or Pakistan for that matter. And you have such a wealth of expertise on Afghanistan here. And I don't see why any one of these, former ambassadors, Rakesh, Vivek, can't behead it and create a body of solid knowledge on Afghanistan. We need to engage the 50,000 strong Afghan diaspora in India that includes over 16,000 students. This is a core strength that needs to be harnessed. Regional countries we've already been talked about. And finally, I think there is a need to appoint a special envoy or a coordinator for Afghanistan that could provide a holistic picture about the situation in Afghanistan and interact with other countries and with other and with the Afghan government and with other interested players. Thank you.
Finally, we have Ambassador Karju. He is one man who's probably the most experienced on the countries that matter most to us, which is Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. He has the dubious distinction, if I might say so, of being the longest-serving Joint Secretary of the PI division, and has also served as ambassador in Afghanistan shortly after the first ambassador after 9/11. So, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sushant. Thank you for inviting me here. I really feel that I'm getting very dated on Afghanistan, and therefore, please forgive me if I say things which seem a little odd. But I'll begin with something that I'm sure Rakesh will agree with me. Policies are made by governments on an assessment of objective situations prevailing at a time when those policies are made. If the situation changes, then obviously policies should change. My second point, again, please forgive me, it's trite, but I think it's important for me to put it before you, is that policies are made in pursuit of national interests. They are not made because of academic reasons. There are scholars here. Scholars assess situations differently, but those who make policies don't have the luxury that scholars have. I believe that there was a situation prevailing in Afghanistan in the 1990s which required a certain set of policies to be adopted and executed and for our to safeguard our national interests. And I do believe that in the 1990s we were successful in evolving a realistic set of policies, and we pursued them fairly assiduously and effectively. The situation changed quite dramatically after 9/11 and after the Taliban were pushed out and sent beyond the Durand into Pakistan. And that required a new set of policies. And I believe that we were successful again in evolving a new set of policies and strategies relating to Afghanistan, and they served our interests too. So the question before us, before any policy maker, would really be, has the objective situation in Afghanistan changed again to require a re-look at policies? It doesn't matter to me if the Taliban have evolved or not evolved. A policy maker is not in the game of seeing that the person or the group he's dealing with smell of roses or stink. He has to deal with them, he has to deal with them. It doesn't matter to me as someone who was involved in the business, if there are friends and friendships are involved. Friendships are one thing, and I'm sure Rakesh and I both, because of our living in Afghanistan, developed deep friendships, and those are very, very precious things, I'm sure, for both of us. But those friendships are friendships. Pursuit of national interest is something quite different. So if national interest demands that we get in bed with the Taliban, you have to get in bed with the Taliban. Whether they are savory characters, unsavory characters, whether an Afghan warlord drills screws in a man's head or doesn't, those are different things. We might not like them. We might shun them. So what is the objective situation in Afghanistan today? Is it different from that which prevailed in the 1990s? Is it different which obtained after the Taliban were defeated? Not defeated, I withdraw that word, after they were sent back into Pakistan? I do believe it is. We are dealing with a new situation in Afghanistan. And what is this situation? The promise that the Americans would be able to pacify Afghanistan, quote unquote, pacify Afghanistan, has not been fulfilled. For reasons that our panelists in the panel before this spelled out in great detail, the Americans have failed in Afghanistan. I do think that they prevailed in their primary objective. And that primary objective, let's not lose sight of, was to ensure that Afghanistan never again becomes a base for an attack on the American mainland. I think there they have succeeded. I would find it very difficult to believe that today, after all these investments that they've made, around $1 trillion, and a loss of 2,300 American boys and girls, they haven't fulfilled that objective. I think they have succeeded there. But then to that objective, they had, as Americans always want, to do nation building, to spread the, the ideals of freedom and democracy, etc., in their own way to societies which are entirely different. There's an organic way that nations, that societies evolve, that polities evolve. We ourselves have gone through and are going through a process of nation building, so we know this. And that is why I think we've been very wise in not wanting to export our constitutional practices, our ideas of governance, our ideas of social, of social structures and equity and fairness and abroad. When I was serving as a diplomat, whenever people asked me, I said, look, these are things good for us. You've got to find your own path. You want to ask me for ideas, I'll give you a few ideas. You can examine whether these ideas are relevant for you or not. So, the second enterprise may have been defeated. That is nation building. But the first they've secured. And therefore, it is not a surprise that what is the condition that the Americans wanted from the Taliban? Not that they would transform themselves. Not that they would shed up the sharper forms of their ideology. It's a different matter that I believe that the Taliban realized that in today's world, as distinct from the 1990s, that was a very different world. No one would accept a kind of system which they had imposed on Afghanistan in the 1990s again. Whether they've changed or not, really, that's a different issue. But I don't think that the world in which social media is what it is today, they can really bring about an Islamic emirate in all its contours today as they had in the 90s. So what did the Americans want? They wanted a guarantee that you will not allow territories under your control to become bases for international terrorists. That's the condition that was imposed. And that is the condition that they had asked of Mullah Omar, incidentally, after 9/11, that you give up Osama. Because essentially the Americans didn't have any trouble with the Taliban. I was present in the United Nations in New York and when the first meeting was taken by the then UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali, or Boutros Ghali as his correct name is, of countries with interest and influence in Afghanistan. And this was in November of 1996. And in that meeting, and I think you can Google that, you please read what Robin Raffel, who was the American representative, and then she was an Assistant Secretary of State in the State Department, what did she say about the Taliban? She said they are an authentic Afghan group. And this is a time when the Taliban had taken over Kabul. They went into Kabul in late September of 1996. So they didn't have problems with the Taliban per se. Of course, they had problems with the Talibans with all that started happening on gender issues and the imposition of 7th century justice or 8th century justice. That's a different thing. Their problems were because they started harboring Osama, and Osama was directly attacking their interests. and their base, their assets and people, culminating in 9/11. And the Taliban refused. And I do think that the Pakistanis played a fairly dubious role there in the Taliban refusal, but that's a separate issue. So that is what was the real difficulty. So today, it's not surprising that the Americans, after 18 years, have decided that enough is enough. And the point which is recurring, which comes to my mind in a recurring fashion, is that today, do the Americans have any real option but to accept either a continuing stalemate, which has gone on for the last 10 years, or accept the bitter taste of defeat and walk out? Now, this agreement may be, as one of the panelists in the last panel said, a bad agreement. So there may be a good agreement, but it will have to be a negotiated agreement. Why? Because really, to defeat the Taliban, the Americans will have to get into Pakistan. And that is something that they've consistently refused to do. And I'd asked an American general once in Afghanistan, I said, can you defeat the Taliban without crossing the Durand? And he said, no. So I said, then what is all this about? So today, Trump has accepted that, and that is why he's saying we'll negotiate with these guys. So I don't see an option but for the Americans at some stage to get back to the negotiating table Now, if that is the case, and if the Taliban are going to become a major party in Afghanistan, then do we have an option but to deal with them? That is the question. They are there. They are a reality. रूठने से सरकार पॉलिसी नहीं बनती है कि हम रूठे हुए हैं. You have to accept realities and then move. And what has been our policy consistently? Let me tell you 3 phases. Great details have been suggested by my panelists and all my co-panelists, and they've all are excellent suggestions. But our basic policy has been, we will deal with the government in authority, the legitimate government in authority in Afghanistan. We will deal with them, and we've pursued that all through. We will assist them in every way possible. And I do believe we should do that today too. The fact is that in the larger scheme of things, this election which is going to take place is really meaningless. The only way it provides meaning is that it will provide some legitimacy to the authority that is established in Kabul post-elections, and I'm dreading the idea that it will be a repeat of 2014, because then the legitimacy of that authority will be very difficult to establish. So, you deal with them, you provide them every assistance, including full-fledged military assistance of the kind my co-panelists have suggested. In the 1990s, we came across a new phenomenon, which was that there was a fractured authority in Kabul, and therefore, and we weren't there, that authority in Kabul was till 1996 was one, and then we dealt with everyone. In 1996 came the Taliban. Now that posed a great dilemma to us. But the choice was made for us, in a manner of speaking, by the international community, which said that these boys are bad boys, we won't deal with them, we won't provide them legitimacy. And that suited us, given the configuration. So we went along with that, and only 3 countries recognized the Taliban. And they were Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, not Qatar, incidentally, which has played a great role today, and that's how things change. So, after 96, we continued to do business with the government, which was the legitimate government. even if it held a very minor part of the territory. And we extended them all support, and that was perfectly legitimate. Now, after 2001, we again continued with our policy of dealing with the government, providing it all kinds of support possible. And that is where the two planks I would submit any Indian policy maker to adopt. But the third point, do you accept the reality of a internationally legitimized Taliban or not? And I would submit, yes, we do. Is there a contradiction between our opening lines with the Taliban and continuing with full-fledged support, including support in the security sector with the government or whichever authority there is in Kabul? No. This is the way I believe the diplomatic game is played. This is the way our national interests are pursued. That is how I see the situation. My last point. Pakistan is paranoid about India in Afghanistan, as it is paranoid about India in every other field. I've always mentioned to my Pakistani friends that even if we wanted to, our capabilities of hurting Pakistan from Afghanistan are limited. If for nothing else, because of geography. And that is, I will submit that when we consider ourselves and our power projection, because Indrani said we are the major power of the region, of course we are. We will grow in power. But great powers too must also exercise caution and rationality and accept the constraints that there are on power projection. The catalogue of American failure that my good friend Rakesh so gleefully recounted was simply on account of the fact that the Americans don't understand the limits of power. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Before I throw open the floor, as usual, Mr. Karju has been provocative enough, and we've been sparring quite often these days. So let me just start with that. You make a case for even recognizing the Taliban, but one of the
recognition is of a legitimate authority. It's of a government.
or
Recognize, please, as a diplomat, as Rakesh will agree, recognize is a separate issue.
no, but you said that if it is accorded international legitimacy, then should we be dealing with them as well as indulging in a security cooperation with the government? So dealing with them, if you have an organization like the Taliban, which is involved in terrorism, which is hand in glove. Of course, the Pakistanis also, and you can make the argument that if we have diplomatic relations with the Pakistanis, then what's the problem of having diplomatic relations with the Taliban?
You can't, sorry to interrupt you, let me clarify. A state recognizes another state or another government. Technically, you don't recognize them. You deal with them like you deal with plenty of people. But recognition is a totally different thing, and perhaps Rakesh could elaborate there.
I think the point being made here is that, let us say tomorrow, if there is an election and we have an elected government which will claim legitimacy on the fact that it has been elected, and hopefully, unless of course it's a very bad election and disputed, okay, but if we put that aside and let's say the election has an outcome, then there is a government in place and therefore you will deal with that government. Okay, and you can have military cooperation or whatever else that government of India decides and the government of Afghanistan wants. Now, if as a result of talks and things like that, you have an interim power structure that gets made, that this government is converted into some kind of an interim government, which will obviously then have the Taliban as part of the governance structure, whatever shape that takes. Maybe it's a 25-member shura, and there are 5 members that come belonging to the erstwhile Taliban. They'll be part of the government. You'll deal with them. I mean, they may even visit India for, I mean, depending on whatever it is. And that's, I think, essentially, so you have not given, in that sense, it is not India that has granted legitimacy. But this was the point that I was making earlier, that today, if there are 50 embassies in Kabul, and let us say there is an interim government that comes into shape with 5 out of 25 members of the Taliban, it's no longer the old system where the Taliban did not have recognition or legitimacy because there were only 3 countries that recognized it, and the United Nations continued to let the Rabbani government occupy the seat of Afghanistan in the United Nations. Today, I mean, the Afghan government, consisting of 5 members of the Taliban, will occupy the seat. And so you will deal with the Afghan government as we have consistently done.
One other small point. I mean, like there are embassies here. We don't like it, but there are embassies here who meet their representatives meet the so-called Hurriyat. That doesn't mean they recognize the Hurriyat. So there are 2 different things, Sushant. Sorry for interrupting.
The floor is open. Shalini, Rana, 1, 2, 3. Shalini. I'll take all the questions in one go, and then we'll have 10 minutes so that the panelists can answer.
Thank you. Absolutely fascinating comments by the panelists. Suggestions from the panelists came about talking to Taliban, except obviously the other scenario which was painted by Ambassador Sood. But about talking to Taliban and getting engaged with them in the probable peace talks which would or could happen soon. We enjoy significant goodwill in Afghanistan and we should leverage it. But as far as engaging with Taliban is concerned, I have 2 questions. One is that, do you think that Taliban are actually in the position to overlook the pressures from Islamabad to engage with India? Because Pakistan will certainly not want them. And as it was also mentioned, that their strategy in Afghanistan remains India-centric. So do Taliban have that capability? Second, I'm thinking that what would be the probable incentive for Taliban to engage with us? Because as far as the security assistance goes, it is meaningless for them. And as far as our investment there goes, Sushant said that it's not that much as we talk about. And that humanitarian assistance can be offered by the other powers like Russia and China who have granted legitimacy to Taliban. So what could be the probable incentive for Taliban to engage with India?
Rana.
I would like to flag 2 actual inconsistencies in the presentation. One by General Sharma when he mentioned that there is a factional difference between Maulvi Akhundzada and Sirajuddin Haqqani. In my knowledge, that is not correct. Haqqani and Mullah Yaqub, that is the son of Mullah Omar, have both been co-opted by Akhundzada under guidance of ISI. The only factionalism that persists is of Mullah Rasul faction and Akhtar Mannan Niazi, his lieutenant. Mullah Rasul is now arrested by the Pakistanis, and Akhundzada faction. The other tribal difference within the Taliban is between the Ishaqzais and the Nurzais, where Haqqani as a Zadranj does not figure. That is one factual inaccuracy, at least in my knowledge. Secondly, Indrani's point about giving more defense assistance from us to the Afghan government. Basically, they want aircraft. Our defense acquisition status in Indian defense forces is not sufficient to enable us to even give, obsolete aircraft to them. So this is a point which needs further deliberation.
General Mehta.
Yeah, from the very useful presentations by the panelists, I think it is clear that in our national interest, even belatedly, we need to engage the Taliban. Whether we do it overtly or covertly is a different matter. but der aaye, lekin durust aaye. That's the first point that I'd like to make. The second point I'd like to make is the $3 billion, not 2 billion. Our commitment is of 3 billion, 2 and one more later, has brought us, as Shalini said, a lot of popularity and goodwill. You know, if any Pew poll that you hold in Afghanistan, India ranks number 1 and Germany comes number 2. But popularity does not get you clout, as Indrani said. You may be a big power. Why do you think Trump keeps saying, why are the Americans fighting here and why aren't the Indian troops engaged in Afghanistan? Why are we sitting 10,000 miles away fighting in Afghanistan? Separate debate. But short point is popularity does not get you clout. And by staying aloof, you know, we took this conscious decision not to engage the Taliban when it was eminently clear that Taliban was a decisive player in the peace process that started not 1 year ago, but at least 4 years ago. And we should have gotten one way or the other. And therefore, I think it is never too late to get into it. The third and last point is on the India-Afghanistan Strategic Partnership Agreement. This was the first that Afghanistan signed with any country on 5th of October 2011. And as Indrani mentioned, that it has a very detailed, there are 4 parts to that Indo-Afghan Strategic Partnership Agreement, and one deals with defense cooperation. Now, I have known Afghan senior officials come up, including people of the caliber of the president of Afghanistan, with a list of what they wanted. And we never provided it to them because we said, why should we give? Because NATO will provide. And eventually we gave the 4 helicopters once and the 2 helicopters that have come in later. I would add to the list that General Sharma has made, and I've been saying this for a long, long time. This very useful training that we are doing, instead of going to Ladakh, we should perhaps set up a training institution in situ, either in Tajikistan or some safe place. Now there is no safe place in Afghanistan, maybe even Herat. But like we did for Nepal, we went to the border, but again, Nepal is not comparable with Afghanistan. So that's one point. And the second is, and which is, we should have set up a field hospital long time ago in Tajikistan when the Northern Alliance was set up. That would have been a very useful, you can't claim legitimacy to join. Why is India kept out of the room? Naturally, people who have boots on the ground will talk, and people who are contiguous to the area will talk. We may be a great power, but that doesn't. So I would suggest that we think about these two. And the last point is on being more active politically. You know, you have 16 people contending for the presidency. I mean, that doesn't require any rocket scientists. We have very distinguished diplomats sitting here, as we have observed, 2 former ambassadors, special envoy for Afghanistan. We should have been trying to get a political consensus, reducing the numbers from 16 to less. So we have taken our eye off Afghanistan. We took our eye off Afghanistan, and it's time we are playing the game in Afghanistan, not saying, oh, why are we left out?
My name is Jawad, a student from Afghanistan. Just a quick intervention on expectation of Afghan government from India. First of all, I must say that I'm happy that there are many people pushing even harder than Afghans for more Indian support to Afghanistan, especially in terms of military. But it's good to mention that hesitant of India has brought doubts today in the Afghan government on how it views India in the longer term. I want to bring it in the context of Afghanistan and Pakistan dialogues. Occasionally, we have had frank talks with Pakistan, and few key demands were always brought up, from unconditional access to Central Asia, to influence of Pakistan on the Afghan national forces, to acceptance of Durand Line, but something that always remained there was veto over our policy with India and closing down the Indian embassy and Indian consulates in Afghanistan. Of course, recently we just celebrated the 100th anniversary of regaining our independence, and as an independent nation, we couldn't accept those demands. And we paid a high price for that. And every day you hear the number of attacks in Afghanistan. 3 days ago, an attack on a hospital in Zabul, killing 50 people, injuring 120. So this cost that we paid for, this huge human cost, brought expectations in, because India was part of those demands. It brought expectations in Afghanistan and high expectations. Now we can debate whether those were realistic or naive, but nevertheless, those expectations were there. And now, even if you listen to presidential candidates in debates, some of them who are very good partners of India, they are raising doubts about this partnership. I personally believe, both in terms of the softer approach as well as military, there is huge space that India can fulfill before sending ground troops. Actually, it's not something that we need. We don't even need NATO combat troops. But do we need advisors? Absolutely. Do we need contractors? Absolutely. We have pilots, but we don't have technical staff for maintaining our aircrafts. Americans, due to their sanctions on Russia and their economic preference, prefer American military equipment for us. They are very expensive to maintain. We need both small arms as well as larger arms. For example, when there was rise of ISIS in Iraq, the Iraqi government didn't push for F-16. They pushed for old Russian Su-25s. And I think these are areas that India can help us, even in the softer approach. I give you the example of the air corridor. When Pakistan closed its airspace, it was not just to hurt India. It was to disconnect the people-to-people ties that we have, the flourishing trade that we have. And the alternative way, which was later developed through China, was very expensive. And the air corridor project that we invested so much on, it was going to become a failure. And it is already heavily subsidized by Americans. It made them think twice about their support for this project. I think, again, this is an area where India can push in, replace the subsidizing, and Americans are demanding India to do more. As a first step, supporting an air corridor doesn't seem like much. Thank you very much.
Any other? Quickly, sir.
Yeah,
so that
one short question. We said that we'll deal with Taliban should it come through legitimate means. But when the negotiations are going on between, say, Americans and the Taliban, where even the Afghan government is not on board, would that be legitimate?
So, Indrani, start then.
No. Mr. Banerjee, you're absolutely right. My only limited point is that we have to get around the constraint, and there are ways of getting around this particular constraint. The thing about talking to the Taliban, etc. I haven't been a proponent of talking to the Taliban, except if they come to power. But I'm not going to make that decision. I think whenever we do talk to the Taliban, I presume because we function from a point of extreme caution, I would presume that every Indian government would take that decision based on a very cautious reading of Indian national interest. So I will leave it to them. The one thing that we all we really haven't sort of dwelt on is Afghanistan itself. The Afghan, whatever we may or may not say, I mean, we keep focusing on the Taliban, but frankly, we should also be focusing on the other Afghan politicians, on the other Afghan, on the government. There is a governance deficit. There is a political deficit. There are far too many factions, too many crossed wires, far too much corruption. You do have to, somebody has to sit down with all of them to say that, this is also not acceptable. And we do need to have some serious conversations with other Afghan politicians as well. I will just keep it to that.
General Sharma?
I won't like to contest you on this, but I have my own data and my own reading on the subject. And if you look at the very succession of Mullah Omar, the politics of succession and how Haqqani was inserted, into the whole group. Now there is enough, I would say credible literature that says that, there is a kind of a divergence of opinion between Haqqani and Habibullah. One is the jurist, another is the military commander. And Habibullah Haqqani has about 20 odd loyalists who are actually interacting with the field commanders there. So there is a difference of opinion to what should be the tone and tenor of dialogue and what should be the conditions and things like that. So from that perspective, there could be certain differences. We have to keep that under a scanner. Likewise, there are very credible Afghan strategic analysts who just said that maybe if there is a dialogue and a peace process, maybe 15 to 20% people may desert from Taliban, which is not a monolith, and actually join Islamic State of Khorasan province, and that has happened in the past. With regard to our giving weapons to Afghan National Army in the past, there were certain constraints. Firstly, we did not have an end user certificate that you could easily pass on the military equipment, of one country to another. And secondly, by the time we got into deal with the Russians, there was an American pressure that they didn't want, probably Afghans to have too much of Soviet origin equipment because they were diversifying. That was another factor which was probably playing in the minds of the previous government, that is, the government of Mr. Manmohan Singh. We should not actually rely too much upon Tajikistan factor. I have been DA there, actually defense attaché in Almaty when this whole 2001 had happened. Tajikistan today is extremely cautious in giving India any space there. They are eating out of Chinese hands, and last year I was in Dushanbe, I wanted to go to this Aini base and they didn't permit me. They said, no, we will not permit any Indians, we don't want any overt activity. So gone are the past that we can utilize any space, whether it is a hospital. We already got a hospital there, but that is for the civilian use and not for any other purpose. If at all you want to set up a hospital, we had done it in the thick of, Northern Alliance operations at Herat. We had located that hospital there. We could still do it there. But a better training facility for Afghans would be maybe Ladakh. Ladakh Scouts is there. We could do it there. It takes only 1 hour and 15 minutes of a flight, or maybe maximum 2 hours to get these people there. So that is another issue. We also have to be mindful of, just 2 minutes. Mindful of that, now there is a proposal that China wants to connect Peshawar with Kabul, and they want to set up a hospital there. So their signature is going to improve in southern Afghanistan. There is a possibility for us to help in a big way in the rehabilitation of refugees by giving them houses, in the famine mitigation measures, water supply scheme, and actually having a high quality coaching facility for Afghan students in India, which can give us good dividends. Thank you.
Mr. Deveshwar?
Shalini, a question about Pak control over Taliban. Actually, it's debatable. You know, I think throughout Afghan history, Afghans have always been extremely independent. Today, the Taliban are not an independent player. How they will react once they are in power, you know, it's a very difficult thing. And I think Pakistan is aware of it. Even during the time when the Taliban were in power, thrice Pakistan asked them to recognize the Durand Line and they refused. They refused to, on the Bamiyan Buddha's case, they refused to, even now, Afghanistan, Kashmir, the statement that they made. So I am not so sure that Pakistan has total control over the Taliban, and especially when the Taliban are fully fully into power. Taliban incentive to talk to India. I think Taliban will always keep an option. You know, why would they be dependent totally on Pakistan? I don't see why it's no water off their back to talk to India. So I don't think so. That is a constraint. Taliban will certainly talk to India. I don't think so. They will have any problems in that. And somebody talked about engage the Taliban overtly or covertly, which we don't. You see, if there are covert contacts, none of us are going to know about it. And they should continue the way they are. There are other ways of talking to the Taliban also. I personally am opposed to overt contacts till such time as that was mentioned. They're part of the legitimate government. Then certainly, if there are 5 people in the ministry, you're talking to the legitimate government of Afghanistan. But opening up open talks with the Taliban, I'm not sort of too favorably inclined to that. On talking about the popularity and goodwill that does not convert, you know, popularity and goodwill what they have given India, and as the 2 former ambassadors will testify, people in Afghanistan listen to you, the only country they listen to. It's not a question of clout. The Afghan knows that you are the most disinterested. You don't have an agenda in Afghanistan. You are looking at Afghanistan's sovereignty for Afghanistan people themselves. And that opens so many doors for you. It's not a question of everybody else's clout. What have they achieved with that clout? India is the only disinterested country in Afghanistan. I think that's not something to be sneered at.
Mr. Karju?
Quick things. One, yes, of course, Indrani, the Afghan polity has sort of just broken up, and that's sad. And I don't think conversations with them would help. Leaderships have to recognize the need for coming together, for becoming cohesive by themselves. There are ethnic factors. There is the heavy weight of history in Afghanistan on account of some of these factors. And that is why in the last panel I had asked a question whether there is a leader to pull everything together and pull it out. Because in post-conflict situations, my experience has been that things get stabilized only if such a leader comes out. If there is such a leader, then things, otherwise it drifts. And there are these black holes in the world where you see that happening. Second, on the legitimacy question of the Taliban, the question is, what is legitimate? There are certain formal ways of which states recognize other states as legitimate. But so here it is a situation where the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, of course, even while all this hostility and violence was going on, the Europeans, all these powers are dealing with the Taliban. So what purpose does it serve if we say that we won't deal with them? It reminds me of the time when we had, in West Asia, we had shut ourselves off from the Israelis. There was a time when we did it. And there were some of us in the External Affairs Ministry used to wonder, why have we done this? But there was that we won't talk to the Israelis. They are bad boys and we are friends with the Arabs. And once we did start talking to the Israelis, did it really impact our West Asian policy? No. 2 other very quick points. One is, while we are looking at participation in the international diplomatic processes on Afghanistan, of course we should have a seat there, and I think everyone recognizes that. But let us not be unmindful of the fact, as someone alluded, that peacemaking in Afghanistan can only be done by the combatants. Those who don't have a skin in the game, through actual military presence and troops, don't make peace. They can contribute, they can be the sort of people who will cheer leaders, but they can't actually make peace. That is why peace has to be made by the Americans, the Taliban, the Pakistanis, and the Afghan government. And the complications there, we all know. And the last point, I entirely endorse what Tilak has said. The Taliban have been making overtures for decades now. And while making those overtures, the point that they emphasize is that don't take us to be Pakistan puppets. Thank you.
My two bits in the last. 2-3 points very quickly. One, the Europeans and the Americans and the Africans or whoever else wants to talk to the Taliban can talk to the Taliban. The point is that the fallout of a Taliban regime in Afghanistan is not going to be on the Europeans, it's going to be on us. Well, that's a matter of debate, but it was there last time, it will be there the next time. The second, the Pakistanis don't exercise influence. I think that's the snake oil which has been sold to us. How do we know that the Pakistanis actually did not want the Taliban to blow the Bamiyan Buddhas? Just because the Pakistanis said that openly? The Pakistanis also went and spoke to them apparently and asked them to hand over Osama bin Laden, and I'm not talking about post 9/11, but even pre 9/11. And then later on we get to know that actually that was for the public consumption, but behind the scenes the Pakistanis were telling them ke lage raho munna bhai, keep doing what you are doing and we'll back you. There are reports that they even gave sanctuary to Osama bin Laden after the initial missile strikes in Khost. So I think we are being rather presumptuous when we think that the Pakistani influence, yes, maybe on some things the Taliban did not agree with them. They were not completely puppets, but on many things they did agree with them. And finally, the point that if you have a government like the Taliban in Afghanistan, which might be recognized by many countries, but you also have a resistance to that government, do we then say that we are not, and the resistance is people who we have been friends with, do we at that point of time say that, look, we are going to have a hands-off approach, we are not going to play spoilers, we are not going to have our skin in the game, and we'll go along with whoever is ruling the roost in Kabul? Or do we then take a call that, yes, for our own reasons, for our own interests, we need to support whoever is resisting the Taliban? Basically, what it means is that everything we've discussed about here brings us back to the roundabout, and perhaps we can discuss this over lunch. Thank you so much.